Todd, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I was surprised that so many people would turn out today to, they warned me not to touch the podium, that it's very, very delicate. But so many people would turn out to learn about dental rotary instruments. And, you know, I was going to ask Jim Holland, would we talk first about diamond-tipped instruments or tungsten carbide instruments, or what would you like for us to talk about? He said, no, you're here to talk about the Board of Regents. So I'm happy to do that. And it's a great honor for me to be here in front of so many people who have served the community so well. I do want to have a little shout out, though, for our constituent institutions that are in the 1st District. First, Armstrong, which is led by Dr. Blyken, and Savannah State, which is led by Dr. Cheryl Dozier. She's a member. I don't know if Dr. Dozier is here today. Also, we have jurisdiction for the Skidaway Island Institute, which is now part of the University System of Georgia. I don't know if anyone here is from Skidaway Island. And then lastly, Coastal College of Georgia in Brunswick. Those are our 4 constituent institutions in the 1st Congressional District, for which I represent. The other thing I want to do is tell you just briefly what my objective is today. We could talk about a lot of detail, or as my management team said, we could become very granular, but I won't drag you through that. What we'll do is talk about what the Board of Regents is, how it functions, and hopefully you'll leave here today understanding a little more about state government and the Board of Regents. That would be my objective today. I'd be happy to end it and have questions and answers at the end, President Mike. And lastly, before I get on my subject, I want to thank Henry Whitfield for calling to my attention that he was just recently at the property that belongs to Wesley United Methodist Church out at on the river, Epworth Gardens, isn't that right? Yeah. Wesley Gardens, excuse me. Epworth is in St. Simon's, yeah. And called to my attention that he was in the Billy Bond Memorial Room. And it just came over me that I should take a minute and talk about Billy Bond for a minute, because he personifies so much that's good about public education. Those of you who don't know Billy Bond or did not know Billy, he was one of our great friends growing up. He went to Savannah High School with me, and he finished in 1970 as the salutatorian, just edged out by our dear friend Hope Felton, who was the valedictorian. They both went to Armstrong, and the same story. Hope was the valedictorian, Billy was the salutatorian. Hope went on to Duke University, and where she obtained an MBA, started her family later, and lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she was a very successful executive with Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati. Billy went to law school at the University of Georgia after having been accepted to medical college. He first applied to MCG, was accepted, and I can remember having many discussions with him about how he really feared first-year anatomy. And he said, I'm not going to do it. And he changed gears, applied, and went to the University of Georgia Law School. In his 3rd year, he changed his thinking. And he went back up to MCG, met with them, and they told him, you should be admitted. You have the grades, you have the smarts, you have the MCAT scores, but we want serious doctors for Georgia. Go practice as a lawyer for a while. And if you really want to come back and go to medical school, we would be glad to have you. So Billy began practicing as an environmental lawyer with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers locally. And he did that, and immediately they saw this is really a brilliant guy, and they sent him to Washington, where Billy pursued a master's in environmental law at George Washington University. And it was there he was playing basketball one evening with a bunch of Savannah guys who lived in Washington, Joe Davis, others, many you may recall these guys. And he collapsed playing basketball, and they found out that he had Marfan syndrome, and he had a heart aneurysm. He had a surgery, and then he passed away at the age of 29. But I just could not have someone reference Billy Bond to me without telling his story. So thank you for allowing me to do that, Henry. And he's just one of the great young people to come out of Savannah. Many of you may know his brother, Tommy Bond, who goes by T-Bond. It was T-Bond and B-Bond. And T was just a great, Big Daddy Cliff McCurry would remember this, just a fantastic local athlete. And he came through Savannah High and college years at the same time as Danny Sims. Many of you remember Danny Sims was a great athlete to come out of Savannah, and T-Bond was of that ilk. So I'll get back to our subject at hand now, but I couldn't hear Billy's name without mentioning Billy Bond. So what I want to do is break this into 2 or 3 parts to make it understandable. The first is I want to give you some historical perspective on the Board of Regents. Secondly, I want to talk to you about what it does. And then lastly, maybe talk about a couple of issues that confront the Board of Regents today. So the historical perspective is very, very interesting. Georgia in a reform movement in 1931, led by Richard B. Russell, Jr. The father had been the Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court. The son was the youngest governor ever elected governor of Georgia at that time. He had the idea that you could roll up all of the institutions in Georgia that were public colleges and universities and have them led by one group so that each constituent university or college would not be politicking and promoting themselves to the exclusion of really a well-rounded Georgia-wide educational platform for our state. And Richard Russell succeeded in having that pushed through, voted on by the people of Georgia as an amendment to our Constitution. So the Georgia Constitution is one of the rare documents in the United States where the university system Board of Regents is set out as the governing body, as a constitutional body, not as a legislative body. So this freestanding constitutional body has authority to manage all of the colleges and universities in the state of Georgia that are public. And there are now 31 constituent organizations, soon to be 30. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So after Richard Russell succeeded in having that adopted, he served 1 term, and as you know, ran for the U.S. Senate and became one of our longest serving senators. Whatever you think about his years during the Civil Rights era in Washington, he was a very progressive force in higher education for the state of Georgia. And that's where the Regents sat for about 10 to 11 years when another famous governor in Georgia began trying to intimidate the board to promote his agenda on a statewide basis. And that governor was Gene Talmadge. So Governor Talmadge had been elected. He saw his popularity slipping. In fact, he was the first governor to ever address the state of Georgia via the radio. He was the first to use that technology. And he discovered, much to his chagrin, that barbecues in South Georgia were different than radio addresses from WSB in Atlanta, Georgia. What he discovered was perhaps his race baiting and his negative tone for the state was not a popular thing now that everybody could turn on a radio and listen to him speak. So as his popularity was slipping, he began looking for an issue. And he picked, which was unfortunately maybe more typical than it should have been in our part of the country and in the country in general. In the early 1940s, he picked race and communism as the 2 issues that he would speak on. So he began attacking the faculties of our various institutions, claiming that some professors were teaching racial equality and therefore they were likely highly influenced by people outside of Georgia and that they were, as a result, communist. So when Gene started this activity, he, for the first time, exercised his right as an ex officio member of the Board of Regents for the state of Georgia to begin attending Regents meetings. And he came to a Regents meeting and he began haranguing the board to fire Dr. Gene Cocking, who was the dean of the College of Education at the University of Georgia, and to fire Dr. Marvin Pittman, who was the president of Georgia Teachers College. Now, many of you may not know this, but Dr. Pittman, who was a native of Louisiana, was considered by many people to be the foremost authority on rural higher education in Georgia. He had a PhD from Columbia University. He was from Louisiana, as I mentioned. Dr. Cocking was the head of the education school at Georgia. So Governor Talmadge began pushing the idea that these two guys should be fired, and unfortunately was able to essentially intimidate the Board of Regents by his presence at their meetings to fire these individuals. The firing stood, but there were 3 regents that I want to lift up, because I have a theory about Georgia history in the last 100 years or so, that the indispensable person, being the right person at the right place at the right time, has really differentiated our state from Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina. Not to say that those aren't just wonderful places, but the history of the Deep South, I hope everyone would agree that Georgia's different. I hope you would agree with that. And so what happened were these 3 regents tried to stand down the governor. The first one was William S. Morris, Jr., Billy Morris's father. So President Mike, you should be very proud of your lineage at the Augusta Chronicle, because Mr. Morris said this isn't right. The second one to challenge the governor was one of the Atlanta newspaper publishers, and I'm looking at President Robb because this is his wife's grandfather, I think I've got that right, Clark Howell. So Mr. Clark Howell, who was a publisher of one of the Atlanta newspapers, also said to the governor, look, you're out of touch with the times. Georgia needs to move ahead. And the third one, the one I'm most proud of, was my former law partner, Ormond Hunter. So as a very young lawyer, I joined Hunter McLean and had the pleasure of being law partners with Ormond Hunter, who was on the Board of Regents at that time. And these 3 individuals promoted very hard that Georgia would be different. Unfortunately, the firing stood, and the SACS accrediting agencies withdrew the accreditation for the University System of Georgia. So if you can imagine, in 1942, if you were not being called up or you had not joined for active duty in the armed forces and you were a biology major hoping to go to Vanderbilt University to medical school, or to the University of North Carolina, or to the University of Virginia, or the University of Florida, or any other school, your credits would not transfer. Georgia lost its accreditation for over a year. Fortunately, Ellis Arnold ran against Governor Talmadge and defeated him in the next election. And Governor Arnold was a very progressive voice for Georgia. He pushed through a legislative enactment that amended the Constitution of the state of Georgia, and that amendment stated that the governor would not be an ex officio member. The governor could not, the Constitution doesn't say cannot attend meetings, because some governors have actually attended meetings, but it is not considered proper. It is absolutely taboo today for these reasons, these historical reasons, for a governor of Georgia to do anything other than appoint a regent. And of course, there's annual funding issues around capital. But the second thing that's unique about our Constitution is it says that the legislature does not approve line item operating activities for the University System of Georgia. Actually, it's a lump sum. So the lump sum allocation last year from our legislature was $1.9 billion That is allocated to the University System Board of Regents. That is then determined by the Regents after deliberation as to how it will be spent. The governor and the legislature does not reach through the Board of Regents and tell you what to do. That's for operating activity, not capital expenditures. The bonding process for capital expenditures is different. So if you walk out of here understanding that the University System of Georgia is an important driver of the success of the state, that differentiates us from other states, that we are quasi-independent from state government, and that we're not to be influenced by the governor with regard to faculty appointments, presidential appointments, and the rest of it, that we've enshrined academic freedom in our state constitution. You should be very proud of the state of Georgia. How's that for a third? Is that about a third? Okay, I've got a few more minutes. Okay, I want to switch gears and maybe tell you what the Board of Regents is. The Board of Regents is a body of 19 individuals representing all 14 congressional districts of the state of Georgia and 5 at-large appointments. So there are 19 regents. And the regents are responsible, again, under our Constitution, for hiring a chancellor. The chancellor hires a staff. We are also responsible for interviewing and hiring each college president as an opening comes up. Committees of the regents lead the search committees and make the decision and make the final determination on who a college president will be. And then with regard to the capital allocation that I mentioned earlier for the budget. So that's really the job and how we're structured. So I am your first congressional district regent. And it's a very interesting history and lineage, and I'd like to tie that back, if I could, President Mike, for a minute. So our first regent was Pratt Adams Sr., not Pratt Adams Jr., who some of our senior members may recall, but his father. He was appointed by Richard B. Russell. After Pratt Adams Sr. was our regent, the next one was Ormond Hunter, who is named partner Hunter McLean, Exley and Dunn. Of course, he served in the manner that I spoke of earlier. After Ormond served, it was John Kennedy. And many of you know Connie and Glenn Derbyshire. That is Connie's grandfather. He's a former mayor of Savannah and actually was responsible as mayor for the first city administration that actually brought African Americans into our police force. And you'll remember just a couple of weeks ago, Patrolman, I should say, White was his name, was just recognized by our county commission and was named captain for a week. And he was in that first group that was brought into the police department by John Kennedy. After John Kennedy, it was Tony Solms. After Tony Solms, it was Arthur Genlat, and that was the last first district representative that we had. After that, the governor appointed Tom Coleman, who passed away last week, as a regent at large. So Tom served in that role. And then for 13 years, no one from Savannah was on the Board of Regents until my appointment last year. So to give you some perspective on operations, the budget of the Board of Regents is about $8 billion. The allocation from the state is about $2 billion. So you can see that our great universities are really only funded about 25% by the state of Georgia. The difference is fees, student activity fees, grants, research activity, philanthropy, and of course tuition. So I think that's an eye-opener to most people, is how that works. So from an operating standpoint, how do we decide what we're going to do? So just like a lot of organizations, we have a strategic plan. And our strategic plan has 3 imperatives that we try to follow and try to balance every time we have an issue come up. The first one is academic excellence and success. And how do we measure that? We are shifting the funding of all of our institutions from the admission of students to the graduation of students. This was a recommendation from Governor Deal. We've embraced it, and our initiative is now called Complete College Georgia, where we're on a run rate to graduate a certain number of graduates by 2020. It's our objective to graduate another 250,000 graduates. We would like for Georgia to have 60% of its population to be college graduates. And that is a distinguishing characteristic from other states. The second part of our strategic imperative, of course, is to be a good steward of the assets that have been entrusted to us. We own 70 million square feet of buildings. And we've had a study completed within the last year. So the proper deployment of brick and mortar versus massive online education is something we talk about every single month. And you can tell that we want to be good stewards. We want to be people who are serious about the assets that we manage, but we also want to make sure we drive towards this this academic excellence that we were speaking about. The third part of our initiative, our third strategic imperative, is to be an engine for economic growth for the state of Georgia. And we view all three of these things coming together. We talk about economic development a lot at the Board of Regents. Whether it's Tech Square, I introduced Bud Peterson last month. You heard him speak about the incubator in Atlanta. The guys are walking around with badges with a line through it that says Silicon Valley. They want to supplant Silicon Valley. They want to supplant the Research Triangle right here as part of the University System of Georgia. So that's our three-part strategic plan. How am I doing?
124.
So I have about 2 more minutes, 3 more minutes? Okay. What I want to talk about last of all is one very important current issue that is confronting us as part of the University System of Georgia. And I want to add, before I say anything, that I am not speaking on behalf of the governor. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Board of Regents. I'm speaking to you as Don Waters, Savannah citizen, when I make the comments I'm about to make. Because I think it's important as a state that we address the issue of educating undocumented persons. So recently, there was an editorial in the paper that was written by Tom Barton. Tom and I had a discussion about it. He followed it up with another editorial to clarify what he was trying to communicate. And I want to be clear about this. Litigation has been filed against the Board of Regents by undocumented persons. And I asked the students that I met with, I spent 2 or 3 hours with some of the Hispanic students from Armstrong last week because I wanted to give them an opportunity to talk to me as a person on their position and what they thought about it. And, you know, depending on where you stand on the political spectrum, I think we all want everybody to be as well educated as possible. We want people to be gainfully employed. We want them to pay taxes. We want them to be contributing students. As my fellow regent, Jim Hull from Augusta said, we want it to be in the best interest of the student and the state to address this issue. So because there's been litigation filed, I cannot speak to you officially. I'm very sympathetic to these students because what the state law of Georgia says, and this is where it wasn't quite handled properly, and why I want to address it for a moment. The state law says that a non-citizen has to pay out-of-state tuition. That is not a Board of Regents policy. That is not a matter for me to decide. The state legislature has to address this issue and determine whether or not they want to make an exception for undocumented persons. Homeland Security, the federal agency, has done that. They said that we're not going to deport you if you were brought here as a child. That's deferred action. We're not going to deport you. But the state of Georgia has a statute that says non-citizens pay out-of-state tuitions. So if you're interested in joining this debate, then you should call your legislator. Don't call me. Is that a pretty good summary? So if anyone, I'd be happy to answer questions.
We got time for one or two questions.
What was the 31 to 30 you were talking about?
Yes, that's good. Sorry, Billy. We are just voted on the merger of Southern Polytechnic into Kennesaw State University. So that means Kennesaw State will have a broad array of offerings, including architecture and engineering. So we've merged those two schools.
Yes, sir.
Hey, now, I've read several articles about a higher education bubble where tuition has gone up 1,200% since 1970. In some systems, not Georgia necessarily, there's more administrators and instructors. The premium for, the wage premium for a college degree is shrinking. And so is this something that's on the plate of the Board of Regents? And if so, how are you all addressing it?
We talk about it every month, and we're addressing it in three ways. And it's part of our strategic imperative to drive good stewardship through the system. One is proper management of the assets. That's why we've gone from 36 institutions to now 30. And I would predict there will be more consolidations as time go on. Because during this time, we've lost $1 billion in state funding since 2009. And our student enrollment is up 10%. So it's a combination of cost management and managing the revenue cycle. Because I can tell you, what you're talking about, Larry, is a focus that's a national focus. But in the state of Georgia, we want to differentiate ourselves, not just from Mississippi and Alabama. We want to differentiate ourselves from California, New York, Illinois. We want to be a great state that's prosperous. And to do that, we need more college graduates. That's why we're not pulling back on the idea that you should not graduate from college. And we want to coordinate that with the technical college system and K through 12. But our mandate is higher education.
Great. Thank you, Don.
Good.